Hey guys, so today I'm going to talk about the different verb tenses that we're going to use in Spanish to Advance this year. So we're really going to focus on 4 verb tenses this year that are going to be new to start first semester. We're going to review the present indicatives, that's Spanish 1, also the present progressive, which is also Spanish 1. Then we're going to move into our past tenses. So this year, like I said, we're going to have 4 past tenses that we're going to focus on. So those tenses are going to be the imperfect, the preterite, the present perfect, and the pluscuamperfecto. So we use these tenses when we talk about things that happened in the past, but we can't use them necessarily interchangeably, so we do use them under certain circumstances. Just like, remember in Spanish 1, we learned ser and a star, and we had to use those under certain circumstances. The same thing's going to happen with the past tense. We can't just, throw them around all willy-nilly. So the first tense that we're going to talk about is probably the easiest of the 4. It's called the imperfect. So the imperfect is a past tense, and we use it under 3 specific scenarios. So the first is description. So when we're describing something in the past, we're going to use the imperfect. So whether we're talking about somebody's age, whether we're talking about somebody's hair color or their eye color, any sort of description, we're going to be using the imperfect. So if I want to say when I was 5, I had purple hair, when I was 5 is a description, I'm describing my age. I had purple hair is also a description, I'm describing what I had for hair. So that would be the first use. The next use is going to be habitual action. So some people are a little confused about what a habitual action means. A habitual action is something that is of habit. So think about things that you used to do a lot or every day or really a non-specific amount of time, but it happened habitually. So this can kind of turn out a lot of ways in English, which can get a little confusing as well. So I could say, I went to the grocery store every day, right? And so that would be a habitual action. I did it every day. We could also say, I used to bite my teeth. That doesn't make sense. I used to bite my fingernails. So that would be habitual as well because I used to do it, which means I used to do it more than just once. A lot of people get stuck in the, how do I find used to? How do I say used to? It's not its own separate word in Spanish. We just form the verb conjugation in the imperfect, and it puts the used to right into it. And then another way we could say that was I would chew on my hair, right? When I was young, I would chew on my hair. That's kind of another one because would do something, sometimes I think about it as conditional, but it's not in the past. I would chew on my hair would be a habitual action as well. It's something I did a lot. And then the last one is going to be actions in progress. So this is kind of the trickiest to explain, but these are actions that are not quite finished. So yes, everyone says they're in the past, so obviously they're finished. And you're right, they are, but we have to think about the sentence and where it's fitting in context. So for example, if I was talking about in a paragraph, if I was saying I was walking to the store when I got hit by a bus, the was walking is my action in progress. You can also hear that ing, kind of like in the present progressive. You hear that ing, was walking. And then hit by a bus would just be a one-time thing, so that would be a different verb tense. I do think that those actions in progress are a little tricky, right? Actions that are not quite over yet. So that is the imperfects. The next verb tense that we're going to talk about is going to be the preterite tense. So the preterite, preterito, is what we use when we talk about actions that are completed, that happened once, or a specific amount of times. Okay? Sometimes we refer to them as a specific time and space as well. So for example, I would say, yesterday I went to the grocery store, right? Yesterday is a specific time and space. How many times did I go? I went once, right? And it's completed. I'm no longer at the grocery store, okay? We could also say I traveled to Europe in 2012. So 2012 is my specific time. I'm finished traveling, right? And I only traveled that one time to Europe. They can be a little tricky, the preterite imperfect, to hear in English, because I could say I went to the grocery store, and if I conjugated that in the preterite in Spanish, that would imply that I went to the grocery store once. But I could also say I went to the grocery store in English, but conjugate the verb in the imperfect in Spanish, and that would imply that I went habitually. So it can be a little confusing. You really do need to think about context and what you're trying to say. The next tense is going to be the present perfect. So the present perfect is when we have done something. So if I want to say, I have been to the store, I'm not really telling you super specific time, but I am relating it to a conversation that we're having right now in the present. So I could say, I have been to the store today. I have been to the store at some point in my life. I have gone skiing before. I haven't been to Florida. All of those things would be the present perfect. And then the last tense is called the pluscuamperfecto. Sometimes you might hear it pluperfect. That is, so it's the past of the past, which is kind of tricky to think about, but if you think about a timeline, this is something that's happened before the past that we're already talking about. So on a timeline, I might say, yesterday, my mother called. She called me once, so that would be preterite. My mother asked me, she asked me once, we're still talking about yesterday, if I had cut my hair. So the had cutting my hair would have happened prior to my mother making that phone call, my mother asking me. So it's the past of the past. A little tricky. A good tip would be had something. It's not going to be every had. It's not going to be like I had brown hair, because remember that's a description, so imperfect. But it might be like I had traveled, I had been, I had seen. It's going to be one of those, has two verbs in it, right? The had and then another verb called the past participle. So those are our 4 past tenses in Spanish that we're going to work on this year in Spanish 2 Advanced. I'm super excited to get to working with them. Something that is a really good skill to do would maybe pick up a book and try to figure out some of the verb tenses that you see in there. A book in English is perfectly fine, obviously, because you might not know what they look like in Spanish, but in English, it's a really good skill to use so that you know which verb tenses we're talking about. So I'm actually going to do an example with you. So I'm going to pull out a book, and we're going to do an example page. So I have my book. I have The Lovely Bones by Alice Sebold. It's a really great book if you haven't read it yet. So there's my plug for that. The movie's alright, but the book's always better. So we're just going to open up to the first page, and I'm going to read, and we're going to stop, and we're going to identify what the verbs are. I find it easier if you read through the whole paragraph first, just to get some context, and then stop and look at every kind of verb. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read the whole paragraph, we're going to stop, we're going to identify the verbs, we're going to identify the verb tenses, and we'll see what we find. Chapter 1. My name was Salmon, like the fish. First name, Susie. I was 14 when I was murdered on December 6, 1973. The newspaper photos of missing girls from the 70s most looked like me. White girls with mousy brown hair. This was before kids of all races and genders started appearing on milk cartons or in the Daily Mail. It was still back when people believed things like that didn't happen. So that's our first paragraph. Maybe a little treat for you if you want to start reading it. All right, so let's look at this. My name was Salmon, like the fish, first name Susie. So we have one verb in that sentence. It is the verb was. So if you think about the verb was, obviously it is a conjugated verb. It comes from the verb to be. So in Spanish we have 2 verbs, ser and estar. This would use the verb estar. So my name was Salmon. We could also use the verb llamarse to call oneself here. So if we think about this, it's going to be one of our past tenses because it is a past tense conjugation. So we need to think, is it going to be I have done something like the present perfect, a had done something like the pluperfect, a description, habitual action, or action in progress like the imperfect, or a completed action like the preterito, preterite. So my name was Salmon. I would say to myself, I think that's a description. I think it's describing her name. So if it's a description, I'm going to go ahead and say imperfect. I was 14 when I was murdered on December 6, 1973. So that sentence has 2 verbs in it. I was 14, was, again, coming from the verb to be. But in Spanish it's a little tricky because we actually use tener when we talk about age, so it would be the verb tener. But I was 14, I would go ahead and say that's a description, so that would be imperfect. When I was murdered on December 6, 1973. So if we think about that, was murdered, oh my gosh, how many times did that happen? Once, right? She was murdered once. And it's not has been murdered or had been murdered. So she was murdered, so it completed once. Over Done, very specific time, December 6, 1973, so that's going to go ahead and be preterite. In newspaper photos of missing girls from the 70s, most looked like me. White girls with mousy brown hair. So this can be a little tricky for some people because there's actually only one verb in this sentence, but some people think maybe missing might be a verb, but it is not. The verb in this sentence is looked like. So it comes from the verb to look like, parecerse, in Spanish, so looked like. So we need to think, did they look like once or did they look like habitually? I'd go ahead and say that was habitual, also kind of a description as well. So I would say that looked like part would be in the imperfect. This was before kids of all races and genders started appearing on milk cartons or in the Daily Mail. So again, a little confusing because it's a longer sentence. I find with longer sentences it's a little more tricky for us to pull out some verbs. But started appearing is actually going to be the verb, specifically started. So if we think about starting, how many times did you start? So I would say you start once, right? The action of starting is completed, so you've started once. So that would be a preterite. Most times when you see start, unless you hear like, I am starting to go here, most of the time it is going to be preterite. Same with like to end, because the action of starting or the action of ending is usually complete. So it is preterite here. It was still back when people believed things like that didn't happen. Shorter sentence, but 3 verbs. So it was back. So was back is going to be a description. Imperfect. When people believed, so they believed probably habitually at this point back then, so imperfect, that things like that didn't happen. So did not happen would be habitually they didn't happen, right? Not just that one time they didn't happen. So I'd go ahead and say that's imperfect as well. So yeah, that's our first paragraph of The Lovely Bones. Again, I highly encourage you to take out a book, really analyze the verb tenses. It's a good skill to have, whether it's English or Spanish, just making us really aware of the tenses that we're using when we're speaking, when we're reading. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions.